The attorney stopped talking halfway through a sentence and looked at my phone instead. It had been vibrating across the desk for several seconds before I even realized it was mine. I turned it over and my stomach dropped. Seth, my ex-husband. He hadn't called me once, not after asking for the divorce, not after I packed my life into boxes, not even after my great-aunt's funeral 3 days earlier. It rang until it stopped. Neither of us said anything. Then the attorney quietly pushed a thick folder toward me and asked almost carefully, "Ms. Brooks, before you call him back, has anyone ever told you what your aunt actually owned?" I remember looking out the window at the cargo ships in the harbor and realizing everyone in that room seemed to know something about my life that I didn't. Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. Some of my earliest memories aren't of birthdays or holidays. They're of standing beside my great-aunt Eleanor before sunrise, hands shoved into the pockets of an oversized jacket while cold air rolled in from the harbor. She never rushed mornings. We would stop at a small bakery where everyone seemed to know her name. She'd buy 2 coffees, though I wasn't old enough to drink one, and a box of pastries. Then we'd walk toward the docks where fishermen, truck drivers, and warehouse crews were already unloading boats. I always assumed she knew everyone because she'd lived in town forever. Years later, I realized that wasn't the whole story. She greeted each person the same way. She asked about a sick parent, remembered whose daughter had started college, congratulated someone on becoming a grandfather. Nobody looked surprised that she knew those things. They smiled, like seeing her made an ordinary workday a little lighter. When I was 16, I finally asked, "How do you remember all these people?" She smiled without looking at me. "I remember people because they're worth remembering." That was all she said. At the time, it sounded like something adults said when they wanted to avoid a longer conversation. Now I know she meant every word. Sometimes we'd stand quietly watching enormous cargo ships ease into the harbor. I was fascinated by the ships. She wasn't. Instead, she'd nod toward the workers moving containers across the docks. "The company only exists because they showed up this morning." I thought she was talking about some shipping company nearby. I never asked which one. She never volunteered the answer. That was Eleanor's way. She taught lessons without announcing them. She believed people understood things better when they discovered them for themselves. After high school, I left Maine for Boston. Most people expected me to study business. Living near one of the busiest working harbors on the East Coast, that probably would have made sense. Instead, I chose nonprofit administration. One professor asked if I was worried about earning less than my classmates. I laughed. I'd rather go home feeling useful than impressive. He looked at me for a second, then nodded. Fair enough. I never regretted that decision. After graduation, I joined a community development organization that helped neighborhoods apply for grants to renovate schools, improve parks, and create affordable housing. The pay wasn't remarkable. The work was. Some evenings, I'd drive home exhausted after spending hours helping families navigate paperwork that felt impossible to them. Those weren't glamorous victories, but they mattered. Around that time, my supervisor convinced me to attend a regional leadership conference. I almost didn't go. Conferences usually meant stiff conversations, name tags, and people pretending they enjoyed networking. She insisted, "You've earned the chance to meet people outside our organization." So I went. The ballroom buzzed with conversations that all sounded strangely similar. Business cards changed hands every few seconds. People smiled while scanning the room for someone more important to speak with. I was already planning my exit when a voice beside me said, "Is it always this competitive, or am I standing in the wrong corner?" I turned. A tall man held a paper cup of coffee and looked just as uncomfortable as I felt. I laughed. I was wondering the same thing. "I'm Seth." Kendra. Instead of asking what I did, he asked, "What's been the most rewarding part of your work this year?" It caught me off guard. Most people started with job titles. I told him about a neighborhood center that had finally secured funding after nearly 2 years of setbacks. I probably talked longer than I meant to. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he smiled. You talk about people the way some people talk about winning championships. I shrugged. I guess that's because people are harder to win. He laughed, not politely, but genuinely. That conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. Neither of us noticed. Later, I learned Seth had been invited to speak about strategic leadership for a large aerospace supplier based in Seattle. He spoke with confidence, but not arrogance. He cared about doing good work. He also carried a quiet pressure that didn't entirely belong to him. Over dinner that evening, he mentioned growing up outside Seattle. My dad spent his whole career as an aerospace engineer, he said. My mom teaches advanced math. I smiled. Sounds like you couldn't get away with pretending you forgot your homework. He laughed. Not even once. There was warmth in the story, but also something else. Expectation. He admitted he'd always wanted to become an executive at one of Seattle's largest aerospace companies. I don't know, he said, stirring his coffee. It feels like something I've been chasing for so long that I forgot when it became so important. I looked at him. So why is it important? He opened his mouth, closed it again. After a few seconds, he smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'll probably have a better answer someday. At the time, I thought he simply hadn't figured out his career yet. Looking back, I think that was the first moment I met the part of Seth that was always trying to prove he was enough, and neither of us understood how quietly that need would shape everything that came after. Long-distance relationships have a way of making ordinary moments feel unusually important. A 2-hour phone call could carry you through an entire week. A delayed text could leave you wondering if something was wrong, even when it wasn't. Seth and I settled into that rhythm without talking about it. He flew to Boston when he could. I visited Seattle whenever my vacation days allowed. We learned each other's habits in pieces. He always arrived at the airport earlier than necessary because he hated feeling rushed. I packed 5 minutes before leaving and somehow never forgot anything important. He teased me about it every time. One day, that's going to catch up with you. It hasn't yet. That's not proof. That's luck. And yet, I'd say, lifting my suitcase, here we are. Those small conversations became part of us. When he proposed, there wasn't a crowd, a photographer, or a carefully planned speech. We were walking along the waterfront in Boston after dinner. It had started raining just enough to send everyone else looking for cover. Seth stopped walking. I had something rehearsed, he admitted. I figured. I've forgotten all of it. I smiled. So, what's left? He looked at me for a long second before reaching into his coat pocket. I know where I want to build my career. Then he shook his head. No, that's not right. He took a breath. I know who I want beside me while I build it. That was enough. A few months later, I packed everything I owned into a moving truck and headed to Seattle. Leaving Maine years earlier for college had been exciting. Leaving Boston felt different. I wasn't chasing a new city. I was choosing a person. The apartment we rented wasn't much to look at. The kitchen was so narrow that if one of us opened the oven, the other had to step into the hallway. The couch came from a second-hand store. Our dining table had mismatched chairs because we found them at different garage sales. We joked that our furniture had lived more interesting lives than we had. Neither of us cared. Friday nights became our tradition. One large pizza, one old movie, no work, no phones. Sometimes we'd pause the movie halfway through because one of us started telling a story that somehow became more entertaining than what we were watching. Those evenings never felt ordinary while we were living them. Only afterward. Money stayed tight during those first years. Student loan payments arrived every month with perfect consistency. Vacations meant driving instead of flying. Anniversaries were usually celebrated at local restaurants where we already knew the servers. Looking back, I don't remember wishing for more. I remember feeling grateful for enough. Meanwhile, Seth's career kept moving. The first promotion came after 2 years. He called me before he even left the parking lot. I got it. I know. You know? I can hear you smiling. He laughed. Maybe the first AM. That evening we celebrated with takeout because neither of us felt like cooking. He kept saying the promotion wasn't really a big deal. I noticed he checked the official email 3 different times during dinner anyway. The second promotion came faster. then another. Each one brought more responsibility, more meetings, more travel, more people depending on him. At first, nothing else changed. He still made time for Friday nights. He still asked about my projects. He still listened when I talked about the families our organization was helping. But work had started following him home. Not physically, mentally. Sometimes we'd be eating dinner when he'd suddenly stop talking. "What?" I'd ask. "Sorry, you disappeared for a second. I was thinking about something for tomorrow." Then he'd come back to the conversation as if nothing had happened. I accepted it. Everyone brings work home sometimes, didn't they? One Saturday morning, we decided to repaint the apartment ourselves instead of paying someone. Halfway through the day, I noticed Seth staring at one wall. "What?" "I think we should have hired professionals." I laughed. "We're already covered in paint." Exactly. An hour later, he'd managed to spill blue paint on the edge of one of my favorite books. He looked genuinely horrified. "I'll replace it." "You can't." "Why not?" "Because now, every time I see that stain, I'll remember today." He looked at the book, then at me. "You're surprisingly sentimental." "I learned from Eleanor." He smiled. "I should probably thank her someday." "You'd like her." "I already know I would." Neither of us realized how precious those simple conversations would become. Back then, success still meant eating pizza on the floor because the dining chairs were covered with drying paint. It meant celebrating promotions without comparing them to anyone else's. It meant believing that whatever happened next, we'd keep adjusting together the way we always had. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They almost never do. They slipped into our lives so gradually that neither of us noticed we had started walking at slightly different speeds until one afternoon, one of us looked up and realized the other wasn't quite beside them anymore. The first company dinner almost felt like a celebration. Seth had been looking forward to it for weeks, and I wanted to be there for him. I bought a navy blue dress that cost more than I usually spent on clothes, then immediately wondered if I'd made a mistake. When I came downstairs, Seth looked up from tying his tie. "You look beautiful." I laughed. I was hoping for professional. I meant both. The drive downtown was easy. We talked about nothing important, traffic, a podcast we'd both been listening to, whether it might rain later. The evening didn't begin to feel different until we walked into the ballroom. People smiled. They shook hands. Introductions flowed naturally. Still, I noticed something I couldn't quite explain. The conversations with me seemed shorter. One woman asked where I worked. When I told her I was with a community development nonprofit, she smiled politely. "Oh, that's nice." Then her attention drifted toward someone walking past us. Another guest asked if I served on the board of any major foundations. I said no. I mostly work directly with neighborhoods. "That's refreshing." Again, the conversation ended almost as quickly as it had begun. No one was rude. That almost made it harder to understand why I suddenly wanted to go home. On the drive back, Seth reached across the center console and squeezed my hand. "You were awfully quiet tonight." I stared out the window for a moment. "Did you ever feel like everyone else already knew the rules?" He glanced at me. "What do you mean?" "They all seem to know each other. They've worked together for years." "I know." I smiled, trying to dismiss it. "I guess I just felt out of place." He didn't answer immediately. Then he gave my hand another squeeze. "They don't know you yet." That sounded comforting. At the time, I believed it. Over the next year, there were more dinners, more fundraisers, more networking events. Eventually, I started declining some of the invitations, not because I disliked supporting Seth, because every event left me feeling like I'd spent 3 hours trying to join conversations that had already started years before I arrived. Seth never complained, at least not directly. He'd ask, "You sure you don't want to come?" Sometimes I'd smile. "I've got an early meeting." Other times I'd say I needed to catch up on work. Neither excuse was entirely true. The truth was harder to explain. I didn't feel judged. I felt unnecessary. Around the same time, Seth's own experiences were beginning to change. One evening, he came home later than usual, loosened his tie, and stood in the kitchen while I finished making dinner. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah." "You don't sound convinced." He leaned against the counter. One of the senior executives had recently been promoted to an even larger role, and apparently everyone had spent lunch talking about it. "What were they saying?" He hesitated. "Nothing important." I waited. Finally he sighed. Someone joked that his wife deserves half the promotion because she practically runs his social calendar. I smiled. "Sounds exhausting." "It does." He laughed softly, but it faded almost immediately. Another guy said people notice which spouses show up consistently. The room grew quiet. I stirred the pasta a little longer than necessary. "Do they?" "I don't know." "You just said they do." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I mean, maybe it doesn't matter." I turned off the stove. "If it doesn't matter, why are you bringing it up?" He looked at me as though he was trying to answer honestly without starting an argument. I guess because I hadn't thought about it before. Neither had I. That conversation ended the way so many difficult conversations do, not with resolution, with distraction. We carried our plates to the table, talked about weekend plans, watched a movie afterward. Life kept moving, but something had quietly settled between us. A question neither of us wanted to ask. Months later, I found Seth standing alone on our apartment balcony well after midnight. Seattle's skyline shimmered in the distance, softened by light rain. I slid the door open. "You couldn't sleep?" He shook his head. I stepped beside him. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally he said, almost to himself, "Do you ever wonder if people slowly become different versions of themselves without realizing it?" I looked at him. "Are you talking about us?" He didn't answer right away. Then he gave a small shrug. "I don't know what I'm talking about." I wanted to ask another question. Instead, I rested my hand lightly against his arm. He covered it with his for a second, before looking back toward the city. It should have felt reassuring. Instead, it felt like someone holding on to something they already knew they were beginning to lose. I couldn't explain why that thought stayed with me. I only knew that after that night, whenever Seth said he was working late or I chose to stay home from another company event, neither of us questioned it anymore. We had started protecting each other from uncomfortable conversations. Neither of us realized that silence was slowly becoming the loudest thing left in our marriage. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was leaving a meeting with a neighborhood association when I saw 3 missed calls from Seth. He almost never called more than once during work hours. Before I could call him back, my phone rang again. "I got it." He sounded out of breath. For a second, I thought something terrible had happened. "What happened?" "I got the promotion." I stopped walking. "The executive position?" "Executive vice president." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I laughed. "I knew you would." "No, you didn't." "I did." "You've been saying that for years." "Because it was true." He let out a long breath, the kind that comes after carrying something heavy for too long. "I wish you were here." "So do I." That evening he came home later than usual, but this time there was a different energy about him. He looked exhausted, excited, and almost overwhelmed all at once. I wrapped my arms around him before he could put his briefcase down. "I'm proud of you." He hugged me back. "I don't think it's sunk in yet." Over the next few days, congratulations came from everywhere. Former coworkers, college friends, his parents. People I barely knew sent messages after industry websites announced the promotion. Watching him read those messages reminded me of the young man I'd met years earlier at the conference in Boston. He had spent most of his adult life chasing this moment. I wanted him to remember where it had started. So I kept a small secret. That Saturday, while Seth spent the afternoon meeting with his new leadership team, I drove across Seattle picking up old photographs. Some were tucked inside storage boxes. Others had been scanned by family members years before. I even called one of our old neighbors from our first apartment building. She laughed when I explained what I was doing. "I still have that picture of you two carrying your couch upstairs. Can you send it to me?" "Give me 10 minutes." By evening, our dining table was covered with photographs. There we were, eating pizza on the apartment floor because we hadn't bought chairs yet. There was the camping trip where it rained the entire weekend, the day we'd painted the living room and accidentally left blue fingerprints on every light switch, our honeymoon, his first promotion, my nonprofit award. Almost every picture had one thing in common. Neither of us looked like we were trying to become anything. We simply looked happy. One photograph kept drawing my attention. It showed us standing outside our first apartment holding cheap coffee cups while laughing at something the camera hadn't captured. I couldn't even remember what had been so funny. Maybe that was the point. I bought a simple wooden frame instead of an expensive one. The photograph didn't need anything fancy around it. That night, I made Seth's favorite pasta recipe. When he walked through the door, he smiled. "You've been busy." I had help. From who? You'll see. Dinner felt familiar. For the first 20 minutes, we talked about ordinary things. His new office, a coworker who kept forgetting names, a grant my organization had finally secured. Then I reached for the wrapped package beside my chair. "Open this." He looked surprised. "It's not my birthday." "I know. It's not our anniversary." "I know. So what's this for?" "You." He carefully unwrapped the frame. The room became very still. He stared at the photograph for longer than I expected. His thumb rested lightly against the corner of the frame. "I remember this day," he said. "So do I. We'd just paid rent, and we had exactly enough money left for coffee." He smiled. "I thought those cups made us look successful." "We were successful." He looked at me. "Were?" I smiled. "We still are." He nodded slowly. "I know." For a second, I thought he might put the frame on the bookshelf beside our wedding picture. Instead, he placed it next to his briefcase on the kitchen counter. Not carelessly, carefully, almost like he wasn't sure where it belonged yet. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. "I'm sorry. I have to answer this." "It can wait. It'll only take a minute." He stepped into the hallway. I began clearing the dinner plates. His voice drifted back in pieces. "No, tomorrow works. I'll review the numbers tonight." "Yes, absolutely." By the time he returned, the food was cold. "I'm sorry." "It's okay. New job." "I know." He smiled, but his attention drifted toward the briefcase waiting by the door, then toward the framed photograph beside it. He picked up the briefcase first. The picture stayed exactly where he'd left it. I told myself I was reading too much into something that didn't matter. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that one of those two things represented the life we'd already built, while the other represented the life he couldn't stop thinking about. And for the first time, I wasn't completely sure which one he would choose if he ever believed they no longer fit together. The promotion changed Seth's schedule almost overnight. It wasn't one dramatic shift. It was dozens of small ones. Breakfast became shorter. Dinner became less predictable. Some weekends disappeared behind conferences, strategy sessions, and flights that seemed to appear on the calendar without warning. At first, I adjusted without thinking much about it. He had worked for this opportunity for nearly a decade. Of course it would demand more from him. Whenever friends asked how he was doing, I'd smile. Busy, but happy. That answer was true, at least at the beginning. One evening, I came home excited because our organization had finally secured funding for a youth mentoring program we'd been fighting for almost 2 years. I found Seth sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and 3 different reports spread around him. "I've got good news." He looked up immediately. "I want to hear it." "We got the grant." His face lit up. "Kendra, that's incredible." I sat down across from him. "The city approved the full amount." "That's..." His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. "I'm sorry," he answered before I could respond. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. When he hung up, he rubbed his forehead. "What were you saying?" I looked at him. For a second, I honestly couldn't remember. "It doesn't matter." "It does. You've got a lot going on." His expression softened. "I'm listening." I smiled. "I know." But I didn't start the story again. A week later, I noticed something that felt strangely out of place. Seth was getting ready for work when I realized his wedding ring wasn't on the dresser. I looked around the bedroom. Have you seen your ring? Without looking up, he buttoned his cuff. I'm leaving it here today. I frowned. Everything okay? Yeah. He picked it up, rolled it once between his fingers, then set it back down. I've been visiting more manufacturing facilities lately. Safer not to wear it around machinery. It sounded reasonable. I'd never worked in those environments. That makes sense. He leaned over and kissed my forehead before leaving. I didn't think about it again, not then. What I didn't remember until much later was that he'd spent years touring those same facilities. The ring had never seemed to be a problem before. Around the same time, the company events became more frequent. Sometimes I'd go. Sometimes I wouldn't. When I did, the conversations still felt polite, still pleasant, still somehow exhausting. One executive's wife smiled warmly as we waited for dinner to begin. You've been keeping busy. I have. Still with the nonprofit? I love it there. Oh, she nodded. That's admirable. The pause after the word admirable lasted only a second. It still stayed with me all evening. On the drive home, Seth was unusually quiet. Finally he said, one of the vice presidents asked where you were at the last fundraiser. I looked out the passenger window. What did you tell him? That you had work. I did. I know. Neither of us spoke again until we reached home. It didn't even sound important, but after that night, I started wondering if my absence mattered more than either of us wanted to admit. A few days later, Seth came home carrying a stack of folders. He dropped them onto the dining table. I'm sorry. For what? I'll probably be working most of the evening. You don't have to apologize. He looked relieved. Thank you. I reheated dinner while he answered emails. Halfway through the meal, his phone buzzed again. Then again. Then again. Eventually, I laughed. I think your phone's having a better dinner with you than I am. He smiled. I know, but he still reached for it. That hurt more than if we'd argued, because he wasn't choosing work over me on purpose. He simply wasn't noticing he had stopped choosing at all. The hardest part wasn't that he loved his job. It was watching him slowly disappear into it while convincing himself, and maybe me, that it was only temporary. I kept believing things would settle down once he adjusted to the new position. He kept believing the next deadline would create more space. Neither of us realized we were both waiting for a version of life that wasn't coming back. By then, the distance between us wasn't built from betrayal. It was built from postponed conversations, unfinished evenings, and the quiet habit of saying, we'll talk later. Later kept arriving. The conversations never did. 3 weeks after Seth's promotion, he came home before sunset. That alone felt unusual. For months, I'd been the one walking through the front door first. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables when I heard his key in the lock. You're home early, I called. No answer. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked into the living room. He was still standing near the door. His briefcase rested on the floor beside him. He hadn't taken off his jacket. For a second, I thought someone in his family had died. Seth? He looked at me, then glanced away. We need to talk. It's strange how your mind works in moments like that. In the space of a few seconds, I imagined layoffs, a medical diagnosis, an accident. Divorce never crossed my mind. I sat on the couch. He stayed standing. That felt wrong. You okay? I asked. He nodded once, then shook his head. No. The silence stretched longer than either of us seemed prepared for. Finally, he spoke. I've been trying to figure out how to say this. I waited. I think. Hey! He stopped and looked at the floor. I think we should get divorced. I laughed, not because it was funny, because my brain refused to believe I'd heard him correctly. What? I don't want to hurt you. Then don't. Kendra. No. I stood up. Start over. He closed his eyes for a second, almost as if he wished he could. I don't think we're moving toward the same future anymore. I stared at him. What does that even mean? You deserve someone who wants the same kind of life you do. I wanted our life. I know. No. My voice cracked, despite how hard I tried to steady it. You don't get to say you know. He rubbed both hands over his face. This isn't because you've done something wrong. Then why? He didn't answer. I took one step closer. Tell me why. His shoulders dropped. I've spent years trying to become the man this position requires. The words hung between us. I searched his face, waiting for the rest of the sentence. It never came. So, I said slowly, somewhere along the way, you decided I wasn't part of that life anymore? His eyes filled before mine did. I don't know when it happened. That answer hurt more than anger would have, because I believed him. He wasn't lying. He honestly couldn't point to a single moment. It had happened one ordinary day at a time. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us accused the other of cheating. There were no broken dishes, no slammed doors, only two people standing in the same room, realizing they'd been drifting apart long before either of them had admitted it. The weeks that followed felt strangely organized. We divided furniture, closed joint accounts, signed paperwork. Every meeting with lawyers was polite. People kept telling us how fortunate we were that the divorce wasn't messy. I never knew how to answer that. Pain doesn't become smaller because it's quiet. The day I packed the last box, I found the framed photograph I'd given Seth after his promotion. It was sitting on the shelf in our bedroom, exactly where I'd eventually placed it after it spent weeks beside his briefcase. I picked it up and brushed a layer of dust from the glass. There we were, standing outside our first apartment, holding cheap coffee, laughing at something neither of us could remember anymore. I wrapped the frame in an old towel before placing it carefully inside the final moving box. Not because I wanted to hold on to the marriage, because I didn't want to lose proof that, for a long time, it had been real. The drive from Seattle to coastal Maine took nearly 12 hours. I expected the hardest part would be leaving the home we'd built together. Instead, it happened somewhere in the middle of the trip. My phone connected to the car's speakers and automatically started playing an old playlist Seth and I had made years earlier for weekend road trips. I reached toward the dashboard to skip the first song. My hand stopped halfway. I listened until it ended. Then, I kept driving toward the only person who had ever loved me before I had accomplished anything at all. I believed I was going home simply to take care of Eleanor during the final chapter of her life. I had no idea that she had been quietly preparing me for a future neither Seth nor I could have imagined. By the time I reached Maine, the air smelled exactly the way I remembered. Salt, pine, the ocean. Some places change so slowly that they almost feel untouched by time. Eleanor's house was one of them. The white paint needed fresh coats in a few places. The porch still creaked in the same spots it always had. Wind chimes moved gently above the front steps. She was sitting in her favorite chair on the porch when I pulled into the driveway. She didn't wave. She simply smiled, as if she'd known the exact moment I'd arrive. You took your time. I laughed through the lump in my throat. It's a long drive. So I've heard. When I hugged her, she felt smaller than I remembered. Age had quietly taken weight from her without taking away her presence. She stepped back and looked at me carefully. You've been carrying too much. I almost asked how she knew. Instead, I picked up my suitcase. I brought enough clothes to stay as long as you need me. She nodded once. Good. She didn't ask about the divorce. Not that afternoon. Not the next day either. It wasn't avoidance. It was Eleanor's way of letting people decide when they were ready to speak. Life settled into a rhythm almost immediately. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, while fishing boats crossed the harbor before sunrise. After breakfast, we'd tackle one project around the house. Some days we repaired loose fence boards. Other days we organized old closets or cleaned windows that had collected years of salt from the sea air. The work wasn't difficult. It gave our hands something to do while our minds caught up. One afternoon, we were sanding an old wooden bench that had sat outside for as long as I could remember. I looked at the worn surface. You could have bought a new one years ago. Eleanor smiled without stopping. I could have. So why didn't you? She brushed away the sawdust. Because replacing something is easier than taking care of it. I looked at her. I'm talking about the bench. I know. Neither of us said anything after that. A few evenings later, we sat on the porch watching the harbor lights appear one by one. Without warning, she asked, "Do you think people earn trust?" "I think so." She nodded. "And how do they lose it?" I considered the question. "By breaking promises." "Sometimes." She folded her hands in her lap. "Sometimes they lose it because they stop paying attention." The words settled between us. I wasn't sure whether she was talking about marriage, friendships, or something else entirely. Before I could ask, she changed the subject. The pattern repeated itself over the next several days. She'd ask questions that sounded simple. What makes someone a good leader? Why do people stay loyal? When should responsibility matter more than profit? I answered as honestly as I could. Never once did I wonder why those particular questions mattered to her. I assumed she was simply passing along the lessons she'd collected over a lifetime. One morning she asked if I'd drive her to the harbor. We parked near the loading docks, where we'd stood together so many times when I was younger. Workers moved steadily between trucks and cargo containers. Forklifts hummed across the pavement. Nobody seemed rushed. Everyone seemed purposeful. Eleanor watched them for a long time before speaking. "Look carefully." "I am." "No." She smiled. "You're looking at the ships." I laughed because she was right. She pointed toward a man guiding a truck into position. "What happens if he doesn't show up tomorrow?" "I guess someone else covers his shift." "Maybe." She looked farther down the dock. "What if 10 people don't show up?" I didn't answer. The strongest company in the world becomes weak the moment it forgets the people doing the ordinary work. I glanced at her. "You've always said that." "Because it's always true." Driving home, I asked, "Where do these questions keep coming from?" She looked out the window at the water. "Oh." Go. A small smile crossed her face. "I've been thinking about what matters after I'm gone." I reached across the center console and squeezed her hand. "You'll be around for a long time." She squeezed mine back, but didn't respond. That silence stayed with me longer than anything she'd said. Over the next week, her health declined more noticeably. She tired more easily. She took longer naps. Some afternoons, we'd begin working in the garden, only for her to decide she'd had enough after 15 minutes. Still, she never complained. One evening, while I helped her inside after dinner, she paused in the hallway. "Kendra." "Yeah?" "When life asks you to carry something heavy." She waited, searching for the next words. "Don't decide whether to carry it until you understand who else is depending on you." I smiled gently. "That's a very Eleanor sentence." She laughed. "It probably is." I kissed her cheek before turning off the downstairs lights. At the time, I believed she was trying to prepare me for losing her. I had no idea she was preparing me for something far bigger than grief. Eleanor passed away 4 days later. It happened early in the morning. The nurse called me just after sunrise. By the time I reached her bedroom, the curtains were still open from the night before. Soft light spilled across the quilt she'd sewn decades earlier. She looked peaceful, like she'd fallen asleep in the middle of an ordinary day. I sat beside her for a long time without saying anything. Eventually, I reached for her hand. It was the first morning in my life that I couldn't ask her a question. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small church overlooking the harbor. I expected family, a few neighbors, maybe people from town who had known her for years. Instead, the parking lot filled before the service even began. Cars lined both sides of the road, pickup trucks, delivery vans, work vehicles with company logos I'd never paid attention to before. Inside the church, every pew was occupied. People stood along the walls. Others waited outside. I recognized only a handful of faces. After the service, I stood near the entrance thanking people for coming. That's when the story started. A fisherman in his 60s shook my hand. "Your aunt gave me my first loan when the bank turned me down." I blinked. "I didn't know that." He smiled. "She asked me to pay her back, only after I could afford it." A woman about my age stepped forward next. "My mother worked nights after my dad left. Your aunt paid for my textbooks every semester." "You knew Eleanor?" She laughed softly. "Everybody knew Eleanor." An older mechanic waited until the line had thinned. I made one bad decision when I was younger. He looked toward the harbor before continuing. Most people remembered the mistake. He smiled to himself. Your aunt remembered the man I could still become. Again and again, people shared stories I'd never heard. A warehouse supervisor said Eleanor had quietly covered an employee's medical bills after his wife was diagnosed with cancer. A retired dock worker remembered her attending every retirement ceremony, even when no one expected the owner of a company to be there. I barely noticed the word owner. I assumed he meant someone else's business. A young woman introduced herself as a teacher. I wouldn't have gone to college without her scholarship. What scholarship? She looked surprised. You didn't know? Before I could ask another question, someone else stepped forward. The afternoon passed that way, story after story. Each one revealed another piece of a woman I thought I knew completely. Late that evening, after everyone had gone home, I carried the leftover flowers back to the house. The silence felt different now, not empty, full, as if the walls themselves had listened to hundreds of conversations I had never been part of. I wandered into Eleanor's study. It was the one room she'd always kept unusually organized. Shelves of old journals, family photographs, maps of the Maine coastline, a wooden desk polished smooth by decades of use. I sat in her chair and opened the top drawer. Inside was a stack of handwritten birthday cards she'd saved over the years. Mine, every card I'd ever written her. I smiled despite myself. Then I noticed something tucked beneath them. A folded piece of paper with my name written across the front in Eleanor's careful handwriting. My fingers hesitated. I unfolded it. There wasn't much written inside. Kendra, some responsibilities should never be inherited too early. If you're reading this, it means I've trusted time to finish teaching what I no longer could. Listen before you lead. People will tell you what numbers never can. Love, Eleanor. I read it twice, then a third time. It sounded like one more life lesson from a woman who had spent decades collecting them. I carefully folded the note and slipped it into my purse. The next morning, the family's longtime attorney called. His voice was warm but formal. Ms. Brooks, whenever you're ready, I'd like to meet regarding your aunt's estate. I don't imagine there'll be much to go through. He paused. No. His answer caught me off guard. There is more than most people expect. I assumed he meant legal paperwork, maybe taxes, perhaps repairs on the old house. I can be there tomorrow morning. We'll be expecting you. After we hung up, I looked out toward the harbor. For the first time since coming home, I found myself wondering whether I'd spent my entire life seeing only the parts of Eleanor she wanted the world to notice. And if that was true, who had she really been? The attorney's office overlooked the harbor. I remembered coming there once as a child to drop off homemade cookies with Eleanor, but I couldn't remember ever going inside. The receptionist greeted me by name before I had the chance to introduce myself. Ms. Brooks, Mr. Whitmore is ready for you. He was an older man with silver hair and kind eyes that somehow made difficult conversations feel less intimidating. He stood as I entered. Kendra, it's good to see you again. I wish it were under different circumstances. So do I. For the next 20 minutes, everything unfolded exactly as I'd expected. The house, Eleanor's old pickup truck, her savings, family photographs, boxes of handwritten journals she wanted me to keep. I signed forms, asked a few questions, and thanked him for helping Eleanor over the years. I honestly thought we were finished. Mr. Whitmore closed one folder, then he reached for another. This one was thicker, much thicker. He rested both hands on it without opening it. There is one final matter. I smiled politely. What did she leave behind now? Another life lesson? He smiled. In a way. He opened the folder. Inside were ownership documents, financial statements, and organization charts I didn't recognize. He slowly turned one page toward me. At the top was a familiar name, Brooks Atlantic Logistics. I frowned. I've seen trucks with that logo. I'm sure you have. They're all over town. They're all over the East Coast. I looked back at him. I'm not following. He took a slow breath. Your great-aunt Eleanor Brooks was the controlling owner of Brooks Atlantic Logistics. I stared at him. I'm sorry. I actually laughed once because the sentence didn't make sense. I think you have the wrong family. No. He gently slid another document across the desk. I assure you, I do not. I looked down. Eleanor's signature appeared across the bottom of the page. Again, and again, and again. The room suddenly felt very quiet. But I looked out the office window toward the harbor. Several massive container ships were moving through the morning fog, exactly as they had every day of my childhood. I don't understand. Mr. Whitmore followed my gaze. The company you're looking at. He pointed toward the docks. She built it. My eyes moved from the ships to the cranes, then to the workers walking between them. Every memory came rushing back. The company only exists because they showed up this morning. She hadn't been speaking about someone else's business. She had been speaking about hers. My throat tightened. Why didn't she tell me? Because she promised your parents she wouldn't. I looked back at him. What? When your parents passed away, there were people who believed you should be raised inside wealth. He folded his hands. Eleanor believed the opposite. She thought if you knew what you stood to inherit, it would become impossible to know whether people valued you or your future. I couldn't find the words. So. He nodded. You grew up exactly as she intended. He turned another page. The current valuation of the company and associated family holdings is approximately $800 million. I didn't react. I couldn't. The number felt too large to connect to reality. I don't know anything about running a shipping company. We're aware. You've made a mistake. We haven't. I studied nonprofit administration. We know. I've never led a corporation. I know. His calmness almost frustrated me. Then, why would she leave this to me? For the first time since I'd arrived, he smiled. Because she wasn't looking for someone who knew shipping. He leaned forward slightly. She was looking for someone who already understood people. Silence settled over the room. Then, my phone began vibrating across the polished conference table. The sound seemed unusually loud. I turned it over. My breath caught. Seth. The first call since our divorce. Mr. Whitmore glanced at the screen, but said nothing. The phone continued ringing. I stared at his name until it stopped. A second later, a voicemail notification appeared. I slipped the phone into my purse without listening to it. There would be time for that later. Right then, I had a different reality to face. Outside the window, hundreds of men and women were already at work, loading ships, driving trucks, checking manifests, and solving problems they probably believed belonged to someone else. Only now, they belonged to me. And for the first time in my life, I understood what Eleanor had been teaching me every morning on those docks. She hadn't been preparing me to inherit a fortune. She had been preparing me to earn the trust of the people whose lives depended on it. 3 days after meeting with Mr. Whitmore, I stood outside the headquarters of Brooks Atlantic Logistics. I'd driven past the building more times than I could count growing up. I'd simply never paid attention to it. It wasn't flashy. Red brick, large windows overlooking the harbor. Employees were already arriving with coffee in one hand and security badges in the other. Before getting out of my truck, I sat for a minute. Mr. Whitmore had offered to announce me as the new owner during a company-wide meeting. I'd said no. I'd rather meet people first. He hadn't argued. The receptionist looked startled when I introduced myself. Ms. Brooks. We weren't expecting. I know. I smiled. I was hoping to keep it that way. Within minutes, I was walking through the building with the operations director, a man named Richard who had worked there for almost 30 years. He pointed toward framed photographs lining one hallway. Your aunt insisted every department be represented. Instead of pictures of ships or awards, the walls were covered with retirement ceremonies, employee picnics, scholarship recipients, and families gathered at holiday events. I stopped in front of one photograph. A little girl sat on Eleanor's lap, holding a fishing trophy. Who's she? Richard smiled. She's our chief financial officer now. I looked at him. You're serious? He nodded. Your aunt never forgot people. Neither did the company. As we continued walking, Richard started explaining profit margins, expansion plans, and shipping routes. After a few minutes, I interrupted him. "Can we visit the warehouse first?" He looked confused. "The warehouse?" "I'd like to meet the people doing the work." That afternoon, I spent more time listening than talking. A forklift operator showed me how damaged cargo slowed an entire day's schedule. A dispatcher explained why weather forecasts sometimes mattered more than contracts. One mechanic admitted several loading ramps needed replacing, but said nobody wanted to spend money unnecessarily. I asked questions, took notes. By lunchtime, word had spread through the building. The new owner wasn't sitting in boardrooms. She was walking the docks. Near the end of the day, I stopped beside a shipping clerk who looked old enough to retire. He studied me for a moment before speaking. "You walk like Eleanor." I laughed. "I don't think I've ever heard that before." "You stop when people are talking." He shrugged. "Most executives don't." That stayed with me. The next several weeks followed the same pattern. Instead of changing everything immediately, I learned how everything already worked. Some mornings began in accounting. Others started unloading docks before sunrise. I drank coffee in break rooms instead of executive conference rooms, not because I was trying to impress anyone, because I genuinely didn't know enough yet. One Friday afternoon, Richard knocked on my office door. "I've got tomorrow's schedule." I glanced at the paper. 3 meetings, 2 presentations, a strategy review. I looked back at him. "When was the last time someone visited the maintenance garage?" He thought for a second. "Months. Let's go there first." He smiled. "You remind me of someone." I've been hearing that a lot. As the weeks passed, employees slowly stopped treating me like Eleanor's uncertain successor. They started treating me like someone who might actually stay. One afternoon, while walking through the harbor, I noticed several workers eating lunch outside. One of them waved. "Ms. Brooks." I walked over. "You don't have to call me that." He smiled. "Old habits." Another worker looked at me carefully. "We were worried." "About what?" "That whoever inherited the company would sell it." I didn't answer immediately. Finally, I said, "Did Eleanor ever talk like that?" He laughed. "Never." "Then neither will I." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Still, as I walked back toward the office, I realized something important. The company Eleanor had left me wasn't valuable because of ships, warehouses, or contracts. It was valuable because thousands of people still believed the Brooks family saw them as more than payroll numbers. That kind of trust couldn't be inherited. It had to be protected every single day. And for the first time since Seth had walked out of our marriage, I wasn't waking up wondering what I'd lost. I was waking up thinking about the people counting on me not to lose what Eleanor had spent a lifetime building. About a month after I started at Brooks Atlantic, my name began appearing in places I never expected. Local newspapers wrote about the company's transition. Business magazines published short profiles about Eleanor's legacy and the unexpected successor she'd left behind. I wasn't trying to become a public figure. I was trying to learn how shipping schedules worked. The attention found me anyway. I didn't think much about who might read those articles. Seth did. It happened on a Monday morning. He was walking into a leadership meeting when someone from corporate communications handed him a trade publication. "Interesting story," the man said. "Small world, isn't it?" Seth glanced down. The magazine cover wasn't mine, but inside there was a 2-page article with my photograph standing on the docks in Maine. The headline read, "Brooks Atlantic names family successor following longtime owner Eleanor Brooks's passing." He later told me he almost kept walking. Then he noticed the next line, "Estimated family holdings exceed $800 million. He read it again, and then a third time. One of his co-workers looked over. "You know her, don't you?" Seth nodded slowly. "She was my wife." The room went quiet for a moment. I had no idea. Neither did he. That afternoon, he searched every article he could find. Each one described Eleanor as a respected business leader who had spent decades keeping ownership private. Each one mentioned that her great-niece had inherited the company, not because of business experience, because Eleanor believed character mattered more than credentials. Seth leaned back in his office chair and closed his laptop. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't shocked by the money anymore. He was thinking about something else. He remembered every networking dinner where people had quietly measured Kendra by titles she never wanted. Every conversation where someone implied executive spouses needed a certain image. Every time he'd heard those comments and let them settle somewhere inside him instead of pushing back. For years, he'd convinced himself the divorce happened because their lives had grown apart. Now another question refused to leave him alone. If he'd known Kendra came from one of the wealthiest families on the East Coast, would those same people have treated her differently? The answer came too quickly. Yes, and he hated how certain he felt. That evening, he drove home without turning on the radio. His apartment felt unusually quiet. There were still boxes he hadn't unpacked after the divorce. One sat in the corner of the living room. He opened it for the first time. Inside were photographs from the early years of their marriage, a receipt from the tiny pizza place they used to visit every Friday, a campground map from a weekend trip where it rained the entire time. Near the bottom of the box, he found a handwritten card. The front simply read, "Congratulations." Inside, Kendra had written, "I'm proud of every promotion you've earned, but I'm even prouder of the man who worked for them when nobody was watching." He stared at the sentence for a long time. She hadn't written about money or titles. She'd admired the effort behind them. He sat down on the floor with the card still in his hand. For the first time since the divorce, he stopped asking whether ending the marriage had been necessary. Instead, he asked himself something far more uncomfortable. When had he started believing success needed an audience? His phone buzzed. It was one of the executives congratulating him on closing another major deal. He looked at the message, then set the phone face down without answering. His thoughts kept returning to one memory. The night Kendra had given him the framed photograph after his promotion. He remembered placing it beside his briefcase. At the time, he'd thought nothing of it. Now he saw the moment differently. She hadn't been giving him a picture. She'd been reminding him where his ambition had started. He had thanked her, then answered a work call. The memory made him close his eyes. Not because it was dramatic, because it was ordinary. Ordinary moments had shaped the marriage. Ordinary moments had also slowly broken it. By the next morning, Seth had made a decision. He wasn't driving to Maine to ask Kendra to take him back. He wasn't even sure he deserved a conversation. But there were things he'd never admitted out loud. And after months of explaining his choices to everyone else, he realized he had never been completely honest with himself. Mr. Whitmore called before lunch. "Kendra, good morning. I thought you should know. Seth Carter contacted my office." I stopped writing. "He did?" "He didn't ask for information about the company." "What did he ask?" "He wanted to know whether you'd be willing to speak with him." I looked through my office window toward the harbor. Several tugboats were guiding a cargo ship toward the docks. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." "And that was?" "That only you could answer that question." After we ended the call, I sat there longer than I expected. Part of me wanted to say no. Another part wondered if avoiding the conversation would only leave it unfinished forever. That evening, I called Mr. Whitmore back, if he still wants to meet. "He does." "Tell him tomorrow, 10 o'clock. The next morning, I arrived at a small coffee shop overlooking the harbor 15 minutes early. I chose a table near the window. Old habit. I liked seeing the water. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. Seth stepped inside. He looked almost the same, maybe a little thinner, a little more tired around the eyes. He spotted me and walked over. "Hi." "Hi." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he pulled out the chair across from me. "Thank you for agreeing to this." I nodded. "I almost didn't." "I know." The waitress brought coffee. Neither of us touched it. Seth rested both hands around the mug, as though he needed something to hold. "I read about Eleanor. She would have liked that people remembered her. I'm sorry I wasn't at the funeral." I looked at him. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know." Silence settled between us. Not hostile. Careful. Finally, he took a slow breath. "I didn't come because of the inheritance. I figured. I didn't even know." "I believe you." He nodded, almost relieved that I hadn't challenged him. I've replayed our last year together more times than I can count. I stayed quiet. I kept telling myself we grew into different people. He looked down at the coffee. That wasn't the whole truth. I waited. The higher I climbed at work, he searched for the words. The more I started seeing everything through that world. He looked back at me. I didn't notice I was doing it. I remembered the company dinners, the conversations, the questions about executive spouses. He continued, I never asked you to become someone else. No, but I slowly stopped appreciating the person you already were. His voice was steady. There was no performance in it. No attempt to excuse himself. I started believing success looked a certain way. He gave a small, tired smile. The worst part is, I don't even know when I started believing it. I wrapped both hands around my coffee. I wasn't completely honest either. He looked up. I kept telling you I was fine. You did. I wasn't. I let out a slow breath. I stopped going to those events because every time I walked into one, I felt like I was borrowing someone else's life. He listened without interrupting. I should have told you. I should have asked. Another silence. This one felt different, not empty, honest. After a while, Seth reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table. The handwritten card I'd given him after his promotion. I found this. I smiled faintly. I forgot I wrote it. I didn't. He looked at the words before sliding the card back into his pocket. I kept thinking about that night. The picture? He nodded. You handed me our entire history. He looked out toward the harbor, and I answered a work call. I didn't argue, because he was right. He looked back at me. I can't ask you to trust me again. No, I haven't earned that. We finished our coffee, talking about simpler things. Eleanor, the harbor, my first weeks at Brooks Atlantic, his parents. There were even moments when we laughed, not because everything was suddenly okay, because some parts of us still recognized each other. When we finally stood outside the cafe, the wind carried the smell of the ocean through the streets. Seth slipped his hands into his coat pockets. I don't know what happens now. I don't either. He nodded. I guess that's fair. For a moment, it looked like he might hug me. Instead, he smiled, a small one, the kind that didn't ask for anything. Take care of yourself, Kendra. You too, Seth. I watched him walk toward his rental car without looking back. I could have called his name. He could have turned around. Neither of us did. Some conversations don't end a relationship. They simply replace certainty with possibility. For the first time since our divorce, I wasn't carrying anger. But I also wasn't ready to mistake forgiveness for trust. Those are two very different things, and rebuilding one has never guaranteed the return of the other. The first major decision I made at Brooks Atlantic wasn't about expanding the company. It was about keeping a promise Eleanor had never spoken out loud. One Monday morning, Richard walked into my office carrying 3 proposals. The board would like you to review these. I scanned the pages. One recommended postponing equipment upgrades to improve quarterly profits. Another suggested reducing tuition assistance for employees' families. The third proposed freezing profit sharing for a year. I looked up. Did Eleanor ever approve something like this? Richard didn't answer immediately. Finally, he smiled. No. Then why are we discussing it? Because new leadership usually wants to increase returns quickly. I closed the folder. I'm interested in increasing trust. He nodded, as though he'd expected that answer. Over the next several months, we expanded the employee scholarship program instead of reducing it. The maintenance budget increased after years of postponements. Long-term workers were recognized publicly instead of only during retirement. We introduced profit-sharing bonuses that reached employees on the docks, in warehouses, and in dispatch offices, not only executives. Some advisors questioned the decisions. That's a significant investment. It is. You could improve margins faster. Probably. But, I smiled, I'm planning to be here longer than one quarterly report. Not every decision was easy. There were disagreements. Budgets that didn't stretch as far as I wanted. Projects that had to wait. Still, One thing surprised me. The more we invested in people, the stronger the company became. Turnover dropped. Productivity improved. Employees stopped referring to headquarters as them. It slowly became us. One afternoon, while leaving the warehouse, I heard someone call my name. It was the mechanic who'd told me weeks earlier that people had been afraid the company would be sold. He walked over, carrying a small cardboard box. "My daughter wanted you to have this." Inside was a framed photograph. She'd taken it during family day at the harbor. It showed dozens of employees standing together beneath one of our cargo cranes. On the back she'd written, "Thank you for making this still feel like our company." I sat in my truck afterward, looking at those words. For years, I'd assumed Eleanor had hidden her wealth because she disliked attention. Now I understood something deeper. Money had never been the point. Influence only mattered if the people depending on you felt protected by it. That was the inheritance she'd been trying to preserve. And every day I walked through those docks, I felt a little more worthy of carrying it. Autumn settled over the harbor before I heard from Seth again. Not through a phone call, not through a surprise visit. A handwritten letter arrived at the office. Richard placed it on my desk with the morning mail. "No return address?" He shook his head. "Just your name." I recognized the handwriting before I opened it. It wasn't a long letter. "Kendra, I'm not writing because I expect an answer. The last time we talked, I realized how many conversations I avoided while we were married. I don't want to do that anymore. I've started turning down meetings that don't matter. I leave work when I say I will. I've been having dinner with my parents every Sunday for the first time in years. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because I finally understand that the person I became wasn't someone I wanted to keep being. I hope Brooks Atlantic is everything Eleanor believed it could be. Take care, Seth." I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. There was no request, no apology repeated, no mention of getting back together. For some reason, that mattered. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a regional leadership conference in Portland. Ironically, it was the same conference where Seth and I had first met years earlier. After the event ended, I walked into the lobby looking for a quiet place to sit before driving home. Seth was standing near the coffee station. He looked almost as surprised as I felt. "I didn't know you were speaking. I didn't know you were attending." For a second, we both laughed. The awkwardness faded a little. "Do you have time for coffee?" he asked. I looked at my watch. "I've got about 30 minutes. We found a small table near the window. This time, neither of us seemed interested in filling every silence. It felt easier. He asked about the scholarship program at Brooks Atlantic. I asked about his parents. He told me he'd started mentoring younger managers because he'd realized how often ambition could become isolation if no one challenged it. "I used to think leadership meant having all the answers," he said. "What do you think now?" "I think it starts with asking better questions." I smiled. Eleanor would have liked that. I think she would have challenged it. We both laughed. The conversation drifted naturally from work to books, travel, and ordinary life. At one point, Seth looked out the window before speaking again. "I miss talking to you." I didn't answer immediately. "I know. I don't mean I miss being married." He shook his head. "I miss the person who always made me slow down enough to notice my own life." I looked at him for a long moment. "You don't need me to do that anymore." "No." He smiled faintly. "But I liked who I was when you did." That sentence stayed with me. When we walked outside, neither of us reached for the other. No promises were made. No dramatic declarations. He simply asked, "Would it be okay if we had coffee again sometime?" I thought about it. Not about the marriage, about the months since we'd last spoken, about the letter, about the fact that he had stopped trying to convince me he'd changed and had simply started living differently. "I think coffee would be okay." His smile was small, almost relieved. "Okay." As I drove back to Maine that evening, I realized something had shifted. Not trust, not yet. Trust grows slowly after it's been broken. But for the first time since our divorce, I wasn't wondering whether the past could be repaired. I was wondering whether two people who had finally learned the lessons they once avoided might someday be capable of building something entirely different from what they had lost. I didn't know the answer. For once, I didn't feel the need to rush it. Winter gave way to spring, and before I realized it, nearly a year had passed since I returned to Maine. Some mornings still began the same way they had when I was 16. Coffee in one hand, cold air rolling in from the harbor. The difference was that now I wasn't standing beside Eleanor. I was trying to see the harbor the way she always had. One Friday, I woke before sunrise and drove to the docks without telling anyone. The crews were already arriving. Some climbed out of pickup trucks carrying lunch boxes. Others laughed about a hockey game from the night before while pulling on work gloves. Forklifts started one by one. Engines rumbled to life. The harbor was waking up. I stood near the same fence where Eleanor and I had spent so many mornings together. Without thinking, I found myself looking toward the cargo ships. Then I smiled. She would have corrected me. "Look at the people." So I did. I watched a young supervisor help a new employee secure a load without embarrassing him. I saw an older mechanic stop to pick up a dropped clipboard before anyone asked. A dispatcher held the door open for a driver carrying 2 heavy boxes. None of it would ever appear in a financial report. Yet every one of those moments kept the company moving. I finally understood why Eleanor had never introduced herself as a wealthy business owner. She wanted me to see the work before I ever saw the wealth. Footsteps crunched softly on the gravel behind me. I turned. Seth stood a few feet away with 2 paper cups of coffee. "I wasn't sure if you'd still take yours with 1 cream." I looked at the cup, then at him. "I do." He handed it to me. For a while, we simply stood beside each other, watching the harbor come alive. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to fill the silence. Finally, Seth nodded toward the workers gathering near the loading docks. "I understand what you meant now." I glanced at him. "I don't remember saying anything." "You didn't." He smiled. "Your aunt did." He looked back toward the harbor. "I read one of the interviews you gave." I laughed. "I've been trying to avoid those." "I know." He took a sip of coffee. "You said the company succeeds because people feel like they matter." I looked at the water. "That's the first lesson Eleanor ever taught me, and probably the hardest one." "It is." Another quiet settled between us. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt familiar, the kind we used to share before either of us thought silence needed to be filled. After a few minutes, Seth spoke again. "I don't know what our future looks like." "I don't either. I've stopped trying to plan every part of it." I smiled. "That's progress." "It is." He looked at me. "I only know that if we're ever part of each other's lives again, I don't want it to be because we're trying to recover what we lost." I nodded slowly. "Neither do I. What we had mattered." "It did. But we're not those people anymore." "No." For the first time, that truth didn't feel like something to mourn. It felt honest. A horn echoed across the harbor. One of the container ships slowly pulled away from the dock, beginning another journey. Workers waved to one another before returning to their jobs. Life kept moving the way it always had. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and watched the morning unfold. When I inherited Brooks Atlantic, everyone assumed I'd inherited $800 million. They were wrong. The money made headlines. It wasn't the most valuable thing Eleanor left me. She left me a way of seeing people. She taught me that leadership begins with listening, that success means very little if the people around you feel forgotten, and that love, whether in a marriage, a family, or a company, doesn't survive on good intentions alone. It survives because someone keeps showing up. As Seth and I walked back toward the parking lot, neither of us talked about remarriage. We didn't need to. Some endings aren't invitations to go backward. They're quiet opportunities to move forward with more honesty than you had before. Looking back now, I don't remember the inheritance as the moment my life changed. I remember a woman standing on a cold Maine dock before sunrise, pointing past the ships and saying, "The company only exists because they showed up this morning." It took me most of my life to understand she wasn't only talking about business. She was talking about every relationship worth keeping.